Going now. Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Jack Bull. We're going to be talking about a conversation that happened in the Joe Heschmeyer James White debate on Catholicism. Dr. Bull has written extensively on the topic of Ignatius, uh, what the debate is, and how that influences the whole Catholicism, church doctrine, and debates of the early centuries. How are you doing today, Dr. Bull?
Good. It's finally summer in England, so the rain has stopped.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Oh, that sounds nice. Alrighty. So, something that was discussed in that debate was James White seemed to hint, obviously wrongly, that there were lots of people that were questioning whether Ignatius, the early church father, actually existed. So I have a question for you just right off the bat. Is there any serious scholar that actually argues that?
I don't want to put people into categories of serious and not serious, but there's certainly a majority of scholars in mainstream institutions who believe Ignatius existed, and that's from various stripes, whether it be Catholic or Protestant or
Hmm.
secular or anything else. Most scholars believe that there was a genuine Ignatius. Now, there have been a few who have posited that he didn't exist. Bob Price being one. I'm not sure whether Richard Carrier would maintain that, but
Okay.
if someone would, it would be him probably. But there's no doubt that when I was at, for example, the International Patristics Conference last year in August, which is like the Olympics for patristic scholars, it happens once every 4 years, and
Mm.
everyone who's there was no one there who articulated to me even once that Ignatius was possibly a mythical figure or a creation of someone like Irenaeus to rewrite theology back into history. So, no, I think that White seemed to me to be clutching at straws and at best was actually just only attaching himself to an argument that is going on within Ignatian scholarship about what Ignatius did right or didn't right and what we can know of him. But that's not quite the same question as did he exist, of which the answer is almost certainly yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that in that I don't feel like really playing it again, but I think the clip that he said it, I think people kind of misunderstood him. Like he's in my opinion, he's not very good with words and being specific. He's often very vague about things.
Mm.
So yeah, I think there. If I were to guess, he was probably like just going off the cuff, saying whatever he could think of, and obviously he wasn't very clear about it, but he's like, oh, he probably, I mean, maybe, I remember something about something not existing, and he just, the classic, like, just make up something on the spot kind of thing answer. Um,
And it's definitely the case that
yeah,
he's right to think that there is an argument going around at the moment about
right.
Ignatius, and we're going to delve into what that argument actually is. But like I say, it's erroneous to believe that this is an argument about the existence of an Ignatius figure. But I mean, to give White his credit, look, we've all been there, whether it be just in a live conversation like this, or particularly in a debate where we're under pressure, that we just say stuff. Right.
Yeah,
And look, many of your viewers might not know this, but when you're debating someone, particularly someone who is very, very intelligent, it can be quite daunting. And we all say things that we then go, maybe that wasn't true.
hmm yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I mean, I've commented on James White in other places. I don't think he's that great, but he's still. I think we should be charitable to the people we are trying to critique here. But that makes me really curious, though. So, what reason is there to think someone like Ignatius existed?
So, I mean, I think you have to go into this question in the same way as you do the Jesus question with, well, what does it take for me to prove or disprove something? And so I think that one of the problems with both the Jesus mythicism debate in either direction is that people come into it with their preconceived idea and then seek to vindicate it. And there's no doubt that if you're on the historical side of any ancient figure like this, i.e., Jesus, Ignatius, or anyone else, you have got a bit of an uphill struggle because you're trying to prove that someone existed who ultimately, even if they did, would not have much documentation of them, right? So, with particularly with someone like Ignatius, what are we dealing with? Well, it's a bishop who is around sometime in the late 1st, early 2nd century, who goes to his death for Christianity. Now, he is not someone like Trajan or Caligula or one of these great Roman emperors who mint thousands of coins and write documents and leave their mark on civilization. He's essentially a nobody. Let's be honest, most bishops that exist now, most people don't know exist, and probably in 100, 2,000 years' time, all the information about them will be lost as well. So what can we say about Ignatius, at least to say that he maybe did exist? Well, he leaves us some letters, and which letters are his is a very difficult question to wrap your head around. And ultimately, the debate continues, and we'll go into what those letters are, I'm sure, later. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we get attestations of him from others within relatively close proximity to him. So although people complain about Jesus and the Gospels being 40, 50, 60, or as I think sometimes even 100 years after Jesus' death, you could say, well, there's a gap between the figure and then the first sources about him. But with Ignatius, we get a pickup on him quite quickly. Polycarp, in his letter, mentions him once, maybe twice, depending on what parts of Polycarp's letter you think are genuine. He mentions him in Polycarp 9 and also in chapter 13. And some scholars reject chapter 13. So at least one, maybe two, within sort of 20 years after Ignatius' supposed death. And then Irenaeus picks up on him again in the 170s, quoting him anonymously, but quoting his letter to the Romans. So again, more pickup. Origen, another one, and we could go on. Eventually, Eusebius is the one, as he always is, who gives us the most detailed descriptions of these characters. So I think that one of the reasons I think that I'm fairly sure Ignatius does exist is, one, he leaves his letters, and unlike Paul's letters, where there's very little reference to them in the Apostolic Fathers, in the same way as we might find with Ignatius, in a different way as we might find with Ignatius, who is picked up by Polycarp and Irenaeus almost immediately. So we have his letters, we have references to him, and then I totally do accept that then there's this further martyrology and hagiographical literature and stories that go around him, which we can doubt. But for now, just the idea that he existed seems to me to be fairly concrete for those reasons.
Yeah, so although we'll never be able to get absolute certainty, there is letters that seem to fit the description that someone like this person would make. And then there are other people shortly after he lived that are talking about him as if they know him or know a lot about him. And what you're saying is it'd be extremely unlikely that all this would be happening if this person just didn't exist, if he was just made up.
Yeah, and particularly in the case of Polycarp. I mean, Ignatius writes a letter to Polycarp, and Polycarp, therefore, one would suspect would know him, and then he mentions him in chapter 9 and maybe 13 of his own letter. And then Irenaeus, who knows Polycarp, also seems to pick up on Ignatian text. So you're getting this idea of a lineage. I don't want to call it an apostolic succession because that'd be an anachronistic term. But there certainly is an element of, well, I knew him, he knew me, and then my master. Well, I know his master as well. In the same way, I mean, I'll give you an example. My Doctor Vata was Marcus Vincent. I'm going to visit his Doctor Vata in June. So it makes sense that there would be this lineage and everyone seems to know each other, even if they didn't meet. So I almost certainly think it's the case that Irenaeus never met Ignatius. Okay. Ignatius dies before Irenaeus becomes a deal. But Polycarp presumably would have recounted stories in the same way that we all would about mentors, masters, and things of that nature. So yeah, I think that because of those two very early receptions of him, and indeed of Origins as well, I think we could include, Ignatius makes the rounds, as it were.
I see. Thank you. Alrighty. So that gets us to the actual debate. So maybe what Dr. White was trying to reference very poorly. So there's the question of the different sets of letters. So can you just briefly survey that debate for us? There's the middle recension, long and short, and there's also different names for those recensions. Can you just talk about that survey of different views on that topic?
Okay, so follow me here, people, because this is where the question becomes so unwieldy for those who haven't really looked at it properly, and even for those that have. So The mainstream consensus was set by J.B. Lightfoot in the late 1800s. He writes a book where he says there are 3 recensions and 3 letter collections of the Ignatian epistles. There's a short recension, a middle recension, and a long recension. And that there's a 3-letter collection, a 7-letter collection, and a 13-letter collection. So the short, middle, and long refers to how much content is in each epistle. So whether there's a small amount, a middle amount, or a long amount. And the letter collection is talking about the corpuses of epistles that circulate together. So there's a short recension, which comprises just Romans, Ephesians, and Polycarp. And that's only found in the short recension. So it's a 3-letter collection only in the short recension. Then we get a middle recension, which comprises 7 letters, including the 3 I just mentioned. And they exist in both a middle and a long recension. So they have more material in the 3 epistles than the short recension has, i.e. a middle plus 4 more letters. And then exists in a long recension, so that's 7 letters with even more material packed in. And then there's a 13-letter collection, which comprises, surprisingly, even more letters, and there's even more material in them. Now, that has been basically the assumption of most scholars since Lightfoot published his work between 1885 and 89. However, this is the big problem. It is both untrue to speak about 3 recensions and speak about 3 letter collections. Yet this is the model with which most scholars are working with, including Heschmeyer and White in their debate. And indeed, that's not just limited to apologists and people who are involved in these sorts of debates. I'm talking about even to the highest level of scholarship. The Lightfoot hypothesis has just been rested upon. What I want to introduce, or I attempt to in my PhD thesis, which will come out this year, hopefully with Peters, is that there are at least 2 more recensions of these epistles. There is an Arabic recension and another recension that was only transmitted through Simeon Metaphrastes. There are also more letter collections, and this is where it becomes completely unwieldy. But just to summarize, there's a 1-letter collection, and there's also a 17-letter collection, and various in the middle: 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 12, 13, 15, 17 letter collections. So the whole debate and the nomenclature surrounding it is entirely problematic. And this was first really brought to the fore by Marcus Vincent in his 2019 book, Writing the History of Early Christianity, which I highly recommend. It's fantastic. And I took it and ran with it for my thesis to explain that before we even start looking at what is genuinely Ignatian, we have to find out what relationship these letters have with each other and the relationship these letter collections have. When were they circulating? Who had access to them? Which text is copying who? And those sorts of things. Because on many occasions, every recension in every letter collection sometimes has what I believe to be the original reading, right? So even the long recensions can be helpful in tracing perhaps the original text. And I should add then, just as a final brief overview, and I appreciate this already, like heaps of information to take on if you've never heard of Ignatius before, so go back and rewind. These epistles are also extant in so many different languages. So Syriac, Coptic, Greek, Latin, Ethiopic, Armenian, Arabic. Something again that no scholar has that level of languages to deal with all of them at once. So there's still so much work to be done to unravel that.
Much appreciated. All right, so that's kind of just the general views, and you argue that just the 3 short recension is the most authentic. So, correct me if I'm wrong, that's letter to Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
All right, and if that were the case, that these 3 letters are authentic, generally, when would they have been written?
So and you made it the point first time, mostly authentic. So as I mentioned, there are some occasions where I think the middle recension, the long recension, and the Arabic can present an older reading.
Oh, yes.
Or the oldest reading, perhaps. But I think that the short recension of 3 letters that was published by William Cureton in 1849, or 1845, sorry, they are probably show the largest amount of the oldest material. So even those show signs of corruption, issues, etc., but they present at least the oldest tradition.
I see.
And in terms of the manuscript dating, again, 5th century, so problematic. In terms of when I think the letters were written, I think that because Polycarp seems to know the letters, Irenaeus, although he never quotes them, Polycarp never quotes them, he just mentions them. Irenaeus quotes Romans, and Origen quotes Polycarp and Romans. So I think that we could say with some degree of reason, although I'd be open to changing my mind, that the original dating could be possible. That sometime around 110, the date of the martyr's death, 108 to 110, I think that's perfectly possible. Some scholars, like Alan Brent, who are actually proponents of the middle recension of the Seven, he actually thinks they're genuine. He just places Ignatius' death in the 130s a bit later. So there is some disagreement, even for those who accept the middle recension, but I think that they actually are 108, 19, 110, something like this dating. I think that's perfectly possible.
Okay.
But I could be open.
Yeah. Right. So that early date would mean that these are early Christian writings of which we really don't have a lot of during this time period. So a lot of people want to figure out, hey, what was the earliest writings or earliest views of the Christian church? So people will come to Ignatius saying, hey, I want to figure out what they view about the church hierarchy or apostolic succession or the Eucharist, and they'll kind of use Ignatius as evidence for this view. Of course, the problem is if that they're using a text that they think is earlier, but it's actually later, that's going to really change or skew like what actually was the earliest views or view of this specific person. So, in your eyes, what theological debates do you think this affects?
Yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head there, because one of the things I find utterly baffling about the Ignatian epistles is that they're almost entirely overlooked by early Christian scholars. Everyone's obsessed with the Didache, 1 Clement, Barnabas, whatever it might, Shepherd of Hermas. But Ignatius, if we believe the middle recension, obviously I don't, but if we did, he provides one of the most extraordinary extant witnesses to the early Christian life. And yet there's only been 2, arguably only 1 real proper commentary on Ignatius in the past 50 years. How crazy is that? You think about how many terrible commentaries have been written about New Testament texts over the last 5 years, repeating the same gobbledygook that they put in the 1960s. And yet Ignatius, no. So the question is important. Well, what do we know? Well, it's important to say that many of the conversations that we've had around Ignatius have been entirely polluted by our religious beliefs, from the earliest witnesses to them. So in the 16th century, when only the long recension is in play, really, John Calvin gets hold of them and says there's nothing more fantastical than to believe a man called Ignatius could have written these things, because it's just Catholic dogma. So it says things like about Our Lady and about Mary that are quite clearly quite Catholic. It says things about apostolic succession, bishops, priests, deacons, the threefold ecclesial hierarchy, quasi-Eucharistic interpretations, like maybe, not again like Thomas would produce, but certainly more developed than the 2nd century would have. And that's why Calvin just has to dismiss them point blank. When we get to later stages in life where other recensions come into play, it's interesting that J.B. Lightfoot himself is influenced by his own position. When the short recension is first introduced, which lacks a lot of the mention of bishops, priests, and deacons, except in one chapter, Polycarp chapter 6, Lightfoot supports it. But then when Lightfoot becomes a bishop, he then changes his mind and begins to like the middle recension more, because it placed more of an emphasis on the episcopacy, particularly monoepiscopacy. So you see that Lightfoot's view changes almost so serendipitously when he becomes a bishop. So we have to be really careful of that. And I actually became a Catholic because of the Ignatian epistles. So when I came to the question, the reason why I took on this PhD with Marcus Vincent was to disprove his work, was to show him that he was wrong. And I came up failure. I had to admit defeat and say that he was probably right. So let me take you through what the middle recension says, and this is the vast majority view of scholars about some of these key topics, and then we can go back and see what the short recension gets rid of. So, first and foremost, the middle recension loves the threefold hierarchy: bishops, priests, deacons. And you have to have all of those. And as a member of the church, you must submit to these people with your life. And if you don't, Ignatius writes, you are lost, i.e., probably eternally lost. So big problems. And he also uses a lot of language around the nature of Jesus. So he attacks the Docetists. He talks about Jesus' incarnation, about the fact he's fleshy, the importance of the flesh. He even ties in the Eucharist as an element to the fleshiness of Jesus, and the Docetists reject both. He's also used as a very, very important part of dating the New Testament, because in the Middle Recension, he makes use a lot of Matthew and John, probably, and also some of the Pauline epistles, and particularly 1 Corinthians. He seems to love 1 Corinthians. So these are some of the things that are being bound to Ignatius to help, certain agendas in the Catholic Church or in other churches, whatever it might be. And they have been used ad nauseum. The short recension, however, presents a slightly different set of events. First and foremost, almost all of the concrete references to the New Testament disappear. Ooh, massive. I mean, Gospels, Paul. Indeed, even Pauline theology. So in the Middle Recension, Ignatius has quite a lot of Pauline theology. For example, one thing that's inextricably linked to Paul is resurrection. Where you find Paul, you find resurrection. In the Middle Recension, we find Paul, we find resurrection. In the Short Recension, we find no Paul and no resurrection. Whoa. Now, it's not just a case that we're removing certain Catholic or Orthodox or certain whatever church denominational beliefs. You're removing key parts of Christian doctrine, New Testament and resurrection. Wow, that's brave. If a second century Christian is doing that, that's a brave move. He's also removing the name of Jesus. Brave. The Short Recension is largely what I have termed narrow and shallow in its theology. Ignatius in the Short Recension is not a theologian. He is a man who knows that he's going to die, writing to Polycarp, the church at Ephesus, and the church in Rome for their own good. He writes to Polycarp to advise him on how he can be a better bishop. He says, pray for all men that they may be saved. If you love only the good of disciples, there is no grace to you. You must love the evil ones as well. Very practical, pastoral, helpful care. Nothing at all that's dogmatically interesting. He does mention in Polycarp chapter 6 the bishops, priests, and deacons, but there is a slight problem with this text about even whether that in the Short Recension is genuine, because it's completely strange. And then to the Ephesians, he just writes them a love letter, basically, blowing smoke up their arse, saying that they're fantastic and that he likes them and that they're doing a great thing, they're following their bishop. And then to the Romans, he writes a letter saying, I've heard that you're trying to campaign on my behalf that I might not die. Please don't do that. I want to die. These aren't great theological texts. And when he does mention theological themes or doctrinal themes like Jesus' humanity or the cross as a means of salvation, he does not expound upon them like the great theologians that we have come to know. He just says the cross is the mechanism by which you're drawn up to heaven. That's it. That's all you get. That's the sort of nature of his theology or philosophy. He doesn't do that. So I think we have to be really careful not to anachronistically apply our own beliefs, theologies, and thoughts. Ignatius has also been used as an example of Trinitarian theology in the Middle Recension. Again, I even think in the Middle Recension that's difficult, but in the Short Recension, again, it's gone, right? So you can't even claim that. Even if Ignatius believed in the Trinity, which again, I'm not entirely sure I could say he did, to try and get that from his text would be an impossibility, as it would also be an impossibility to say he was an Arian or a modalist or any other of these later church debates that I had at Nicaea or Constantinople or Chalcedon. He just doesn't think about it in the same way. He does recognize there are false teachers. He says, beware of them. But he doesn't tell it doesn't tell us in the Short Recension what his false teaching is, what these false teachings are of other people. So ultimately, in the short recension, we're left with basically the stories of a man who is being in an advisory role to Polycarp, a friendship role to the Ephesians, and a begging role to the Romans. And that's it. There is, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, some hints at some theologies that we could look at and use as an example of why we might believe things later on in the church. But I would still be cautious to retrospectively apply them to him.
Yeah, I see. So if people didn't notice, I attempted to put the three separate different texts we have of his letters collections on the screen here.
If I just talk about those as well. So these are the common 3 letter collections, right? That you're looking at here. But Polycarp and Romans are both transmitted on their own. In fact, the vast majority of manuscripts we have for Romans are part of the Ignatian story of martyrdom and not part of an Ignatian corpus. Polycarp is also transmitted on its own in one Syriac text, only in the short recension. Now, the middle recension, which you've put there, that actually exists in no manuscript. This is in no way attested, except by Eusebius, who says Ignatius wrote a 7-letter collection, and he enumerates those 7 letters. But we don't have any manuscript for this, of them in the middle recension. We have them in the long recension, but that's not what most scholars believe in. And we have them in the middle recension, but only as part of the large letter collection. So they're only appended with the other 6 letters. You see? So the idea of a 7-letter collection of middle recension is only a Eusebian one. We have no manuscript data for that. And then when it comes to the long recension, we have a 12 and a 13-letter collection, because you'll notice at the bottom there it says Mary to Ignatius and Ignatius to Mary. These are not to Mary Magdalene or Mary the Virgin. They're to a certain Mary of Casabolita and her response to him. Now, there are actually more letters attributed to Ignatius, 2 of which are to the Virgin Mary, and 1 of which is to John, the Apostle. But we don't even think about those because they're quite obviously medieval inventions. So actually, if you want to go and do work on those, do, but don't at all try and bung them into this debate. So the 3 recensions we're looking at there, which are also comprised of a 1-letter collection, 3, 7, 9. I say 9 because there's one family of manuscripts that has a corruption at the end. So we think it was a 12-letter collection, but we've lost the extra 3.5. Or 2.5, bad maths. And then the long recension, again, is the 13-letter collection, like the 12. So again, there's such a jumbled nomenclature going on here. And that's why I've chosen to attempt to forego them in my work to see if we can start changing the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. If we could go back to I just want to summarize what you had said. So you talked about how, people kind of use the later letters, the middle recension that you think was written later, to try to talk about what the earlier Christians believed. So you talked about, briefly mentioned the Eucharist. There's a question of like the Trinity. There's a question of the bishops and other doctrine. But you also talked about how that could even affect Paul's writings, or how we view Paul's writings. And because I think you kind of mentioned it, but maybe you didn't. This could also affect the dating of the Gospels, right? Because if people are using Ignatius texts to say, hey, if Ignatius is writing on these Gospels or other New Testament texts, but that Ignatius text didn't actually exist, then that changes how we date it, or the evidence for that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And that's why I think that the work we're doing on Ignatius is so important, because the ramifications are massive. Ignatius, like I said, is often used to help date Paul, often used to help date Matthew and John. That has to now be reassessed. And I'm not at all claiming that just because you reject the middle recension, you now have to reject all New Testament study. You can still carry on with that if you think so. I am now of a small minority who don't believe that the Gospels are first century, or at least not finished texts in the first century, that they're still evolving and growing. And part of that is because Ignatius doesn't have it. Where with the Pauline stuff, I think it becomes more interesting, and this is massive, I think, is this relationship between resurrection and Paul, and the fact that, again, when only you have Pauline text quoted, do you have resurrection mentioned? That's really, really striking then, that Ignatius doesn't have the resurrection as well and doesn't have Paul. Like, he joins in that general theme. In addition to that, he seems to contradict Paul at times, right? So if he has Paul, and actually he does quote him in every recension, not quote him his text, he mentions the name. He says to them in Romans, I do not command you as if I were Peter or Paul, for they were free men and I am a slave to Christ. Don't know what he means by that quite, but he does know these two figures. He doesn't use Pauline theology that we know, i.e. faith, the importance of faith, the importance of resurrection, the Holy Spirit, tongues. We've just been talking on Patristica in our last episode about tongues and how important tongues is and what that looks like in the early church. Ignatius doesn't know any of this. So how has he come from a Pauline background with this great apostle to the Gentiles and not know a single thing that Paul believes in, any of the emphasis that Paul has in his life? He then also says, remember, Paul has that thing about slavery. He says, well, if you get a chance to be free, then you should, right? That you should maybe go for freedom. Ignatius says, no. You must not become a free slave, because if you do, you'll become a slave to your own desires. Again, ambiguous as to what he means there. But this is not the same understanding that Paul has. So if I'm right, then either it's the case that the Gospels are not as important or prevalent as we thought they were among early Christians. People often point to Papias of Hierapolis as an example of his use of Matthew, Mark, and John. Again, not Luke. Or he thinks that they're not prevalent, or he thinks that he doesn't have them. That's the other option, right? They're either not prevalent or he doesn't have them. Because I cannot imagine a world where he has them, recognizes Paul and the other gospel writers as authoritative, and then chooses to ignore and or contradict them. That seems to be a step too far for me. So we're only left with one of the two options. Now, it's my belief that he just doesn't have these texts. I don't think he has the Pauline epistles, nor do I think he has the Gospels. And so our New Testament colleagues now have to think, well, why not? How is it that this Antiochian bishop doesn't have them, yet he knows the names of Peter and Paul? Strange.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So I think a big critique that I've seen of your work is that, so you point to maybe a theme that is only in the later Ignatius texts, not in the earlier, or something like the resurrection, where we would really expect Ignatius to be talking about resurrection if he is aware of these other letters of Paul or the Gospels. But obviously there's a situation where someone would just might not want to comment on it, like if it's not relevant to what they want to talk about. Like if, for example, Ignatius is only concerned about dying, maybe he might not talk about resurrection. Or, if I'm writing a recipe book, I'm not going to be talking about quantum physics because it's just not the topic. So could you just briefly talk about that before we get into maybe more evidence for your views here? So just could you explicitly talk about why you're okay with making those types of claims, like, hey, Ignatius doesn't seem to talk about this, therefore he probably didn't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is only one element of a plethora of reasons that
Yeah.
I think that this theory is true. But I'd say and so I have Alan Brent. Alan Brent is an exquisite, brilliant man, Ignatian scholar. He's just written a paper against me, or not against me, saying I'm wrong for an upcoming volume of Studia Patristica. And he lays these accusations down. And we had this discussion at the conference last year. He said, look, Jack, Ignatius doesn't, in the short sense, he's talking about different bits and different things, and the redactor removes this because it's for a different purpose. He says that these are amanuenses or secretaries that are writing these things down in different ways for different groups or whatever. That's his argument, general consensus. Look, my argument is this: the current consensus of the middle recension people is that someone at the end of the 2nd century takes the middle recension of Ignatius and redacts it to create this short version. That's the general theme. That's what Lightfoot thought. That's what Zahn thought. That's what many of these others thought. That someone takes this middle recension and redacts it. Okay, fine. Let's even give the fact that this person could be considered in retrospect a heretic, right? He's not part of the proto-Orthodox Church. Fine. Who in their right minds remove resurrection? I mean, actually, just seriously, who removes resurrection? Who removes bishops, priests, and deacons in all occasions except one? Who removes the name of Jesus? Who removes salutations and greetings to people that Ignatius knew? In particular, to Crocus and Burrus and some of these other names that an alky that he mentions. Who is going about actually bothering to do this? Now, you can see why they might remove, let's say, references to, if they were Docetic, if they were Docetic, they might remove references to the Eucharist. Fair enough. You could see why, if they believed in a more charismatic leadership in church, they would remove the threefold hierarchy, except in one place where they left it. But resurrection, the name of Jesus. I mean, I struggle so strongly to think that that could happen. Now, again, it's possible. I can't think of a motive, but it's possible. Whereas when one considers it the other way, let's think about what happens there. Clearly, to my mind, by the end of the 2nd century, the role of the bishop is becoming more important. Canonical texts are beginning to be more highly established, particularly after the advent of Irenaeus. See, even with Justin, we forget that Justin doesn't really use Paul. But as Irenaeus then makes his mark, what happens in a post-Irenaean world? Canon, or not canon per se, but use of these texts becomes more prevalent, more wide known, bishops, etc. You get the text of Ignatius at the beginning of the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd century. They don't have any of these things. You panic. What do? You write them in. Hey, look, we've always had apostolic succession. Hey, look, we've always had the canon. Hey, look, we've always had the resurrection and Pauline theology. Occam's razor to me, I think, on that occasion, that I could totally see a motivation for one, but not for the other. Now, that alone is not enough to vindicate my position, but hopefully we'll have a chance to say some of the other reasons in a minute. But when I posed this to Alan and some of the colleagues, they did struggle. They did really struggle.
So you talk about removed. So you're saying that the scholars arguing that someone along the lines removed specific sentences or things that Ignatius said. But what about the topic of not mentioned? So just like, you know, as I say, as I use my example, like if I'm trying to write a cooking book, I'm not going to talk about quantum mechanics. So maybe Ignatius just wasn't thinking about it, didn't have it on his mind. Could you go more in detail about that? Why these different topics? Why, while it's not simple, while it's not enough to just say, "Hey, Ignatius just must not have been thinking about resurrection."
Well, I will accept that for some theologies, right? I mean, again, these letters are only brief in the short recension. So, to say that he should have included every major Christian dogma quoted as the Nicene Creed 200 years prior, whatever, of course not. But I just want to reiterate again that it's not like I'm asking or looking for themes that are particularly strange or startling to even early Christians. And that actually Ignatius in the short recension finds himself to be quite similar to his contemporaries with the lack of resurrection. If you look to other apostolic texts, and I recommend Marcus Vincent's book Resurrection and Early Christianity for this, where he was tasked with writing a book about what the early church believed on resurrection. So he went looking and came up pretty empty, right? So actually Ignatius finds himself just like his contemporaries. Now, I think Ignatius probably does believe in the resurrection. I think he probably does know about it. But in the short recension, I think that one of the reasons it's not on his mind is because he's more interested in the bit that has effect on his life, namely the cross. That's the thing that changes everything. I always use this analogy to my students when I teach any theology. If Jesus is hit by a bus and comes back from the dead, well, then that's not relevant to Christians, right? Because that's not an atonement, sacrifice, or whatever offering to God. That's Jesus being pretty unlucky. So the cross is the bit that matters, really. And that's the focus of many of the early Christian texts. When it comes to the canon, however, I do draw more of a a problem there with the whole recipe book analogy. If we are to believe that the apostles, in particular Paul's letters, are circulating at this time, and that Ignatius has access to them, he cannot. I don't think he can even overlook them. But if he does overlook them, he can't contradict them, surely. He cannot disagree with Paul, especially if, again, we're believing that he believes in this apostolic succession, the significance of the apostles and their place in the history of the church. For him to then say, well, grace. What's grace? What's faith? Who cares? For Ignatius, he can only be saved by his martyrdom. He says, I'm only going to be worthy of God if I die for it. I think Paul would have balked at that as an idea. Paul would have said, no, you're saved by grace alone, not by your works. And Ignatius says, no, it's death or nothing for me, son. And then, in addition to that, he then talks about slavery in a different manner. And so we could talk about recipe books, but these are core themes that we are made to believe that are central to all of Christians. And yet Ignatius stands as an anomaly. And the idea that a late 2nd century Christian is rewriting the text to take those things out, what? That goes against the recipe analogy, right? That someone is rewriting the recipe book, saying, well, you can bake a cake. Here's our brilliant cake. And at the end of the 2nd century, it says, yeah, we like cake, but actually we like bitter cake. Take out all the sugar. Well, nobody wants it. Nobody wants that cake. I think that analogy falls down with the original idea. Whereas in my belief, in my understanding of the early church, the short recension, Ignatius writes a very basic text, and the later church fathers get upset that it's not a cake, so they make it one. Maybe we're drawing the cookery too finely here, but you get the picture, right? You could totally see why one would interpolate, but not necessarily why one would redact.
I see. So, in your eyes, you can come up with a explanation for why something might not be mentioned, but there's still the question of what's the most probable thing. And this, compared with other evidence, as you say, makes you think that the later or the larger amount of letters, the middle or the long recension, are not the correct views.
Yeah, and then we can then begin to build off that. So where I accept Alan and Co.'s position is that, yeah, a redactor could just see the word bishop and remove it. I can't see a motivation before it. But do I think it's an impossible task? No. Where it gets more impossible, and this was the real crux of my work.
Oh.
So in 2019, in Marcus's book, Writing the History of Early Christianity, he looked through every letter that began with every word that began with alpha in all of the Ignatian epistles, in the short and the middle, right? So Polycarp, Ephesians, Romans, and then Magnesians, Philadelphians, Spinaeans, Trallians, right? Just that words beginning with alpha. And he found that a striking amount of words, which are not theologically charged words. So words in English that you wouldn't even think about, like however, but, therefore, whatever, things like this. The middle recension uses some of them loads of times, and then magically they disappear in the short recension. So I thought to myself, right, where Marcus started with alpha, I will now go beta through omega and look at every single word used in the 7 epistles and compare it to the short recension. Now, what's interesting is that in 1963, Milton Perry Brown performed almost an identical experiment in the hope of proving the middle recension to be true compared to the long. So the methodology here, ironically, is the exact one used by proponents of the middle recension to prove why the long recension is an interpolation of the former. So, repeat, rinse and repeat. Let's see what happens to the short and the middle. I found that basic parts of speech, prepositions, conjunctions, adverbs, compound words, these non-loaded words are used with a frightening degree of difference between the short and the middle recension. These are stylometric indicators, right? Things that you and I, unless we're really like linguists who are trying to concentrate on this stuff, we use every day without thinking. I always do a formative assessment with my students, and after reading one of their essays, I know what they're going to write for their final assessments, and I'll know if they've used someone else or cheated, or etc. Because they can't help the way they write. Because I don't tell them what I'm doing, so subconsciously they just don't think about it. This same is true here. Every part of the middle recension that isn't attested by the short recension shows not only a different lexic, but stylometric differences as well. And just as a case study for this sort of methodology, apart from my anecdotal one, the FBI, and I don't want to sort of create a big argument about it in the comments, please don't go mad. But the FBI, when they were looking for the January 6th insurrectionists and the tweets that were going around surrounding them, they used this sort of stylometric analysis to see whether they could track multiple accounts held by one person to see if they could find a commonality in their speech. And would you believe it, lo and behold, even in a few characters, I don't know what Twitter was back then, I know they changed their amount of characters, they could show that one person was producing the same amount of tweets on different accounts, just using their small words, what we call the small words or function words. So all I did was apply this to the short and middle recension. Then I found out that actually this methodology has been used for years, both in English literature, but also in classical studies with people like Plato, Aristotle, Dionysius, to try and work out who's writing what. So the methodology was completely sound. And when I did it for the Ignatian epistles, as I said, everywhere with the middle recension is not attested by the short, the style, the lexic, the everything you can think of was different, not just the theology. I then wager with Lightfoot, who argues that an interpolation would be impossible, that actually a redaction would be impossible. To remove words like gamma, alpha, rho, just means 4. To remove that in almost all of the parts where it appears, I mean, why? Who's doing that? What's the point? What a waste of your day to surgically go through and remove gar. And I could point to many others of these, whether it be prepositional adverbs or whatever. I'll just give one more example because I think this is a good one. There's one that Milton Perry Brown says in his middle recension, long recension comparison. He says the word horis, which means without, is absolutely an Ignatian word. He says it's indicative of the style of Ignatius to say horis and then mention the bishop. So you cannot live without the bishop. You cannot worship without the bishop. You cannot do anything without the bishop. He says that is Ignatius all over. And they're the things we should look for when we're looking for the genuine Ignatius. In the short recension, that word is entirely absent. This supposedly typical Ignatian word, a redactor, according to Brown, has gone through and just plucked it out. Come on. Who is taking the word without from a text? I mean, I think this is an impossibility. I think it would be the work of an AI bot more than a manuscript transcribing a scribe transcribing a manuscript of the middle into the short to go, no, oh, there's the word through again, get it out.
I appreciate that. Alrighty, so that was a lot of analysis there about specific words. You talked about not just topics that are kind of missing in the different letters, but there are also words that are just basic words but therefore that you would not expect to be different between the texts if they are writing from the same person. So I'm just trying to anticipate what people might be saying. So maybe someone might say, hey, the language changed between the letters. Like, I don't know, sometimes I talk one way one day and another day I might talk a different way, or I might just use different words. Or you don't see that as a possibility that could be happening here.
Well, I do in the sense that the both the style and grammar and lexic could change by the end of the 2nd century. I appreciate that that's true, but that's exactly why the middle recension's interpolator makes such a bungle of it, because he doesn't understand early Christianity in the beginning of 180, 90 years before. That's why there is such a difference. It's precisely what you're saying. You cannot account for the difference the other way, though, that someone can remove these words. Like, that's something you can't account for, because it would be both a surgical removal of, but also then the removal of theological positions, which to me, you can't, how could you see a world for that? How would you go back and know at the beginning of the 2nd century what a way to speak was? You weren't there. In the converse, which what I'm suggesting, yeah, if you're trying to write new material at the end of the 2nd century, you write differently. That's why these two texts differ. So I see your point, but I think it only proves mine rather than contradicts it, right?
Mm.
That you can't replicate backward, but you can definitely make a mistake going forward.
Yeah. All right, just real quick, what about audience specific style? So, say I might write or talk one way to my father in a more respectable way compared to with my wife or one of my friends or even a little kid. I might talk differently there. What do you think about something like that, where that's a possibility, where people are just talking or differently?
Yeah, and I think that does play out in Polycarp, right? In all recensions, Polycarp has always been a slightly strange letter, because it comes out differently in stylometric analyses. However, um, uh, yeah, I could see that. I could see that he would write differently to Polycarp. Polycarp is his equal. He has met Polycarp fairly recently. That's fine. So he doesn't want to wangle on about all the things they've already covered. If I send you an email after this, I won't give you a transcript of the last 52 minutes. But again, I reiterate that you, irrespective of whether you're talking to your wife, your child, your boss, the word without, for, and through are not words that you're going to be taking out of your lectionary. I just can't, or your dictionary, sorry. I don't see why you would do that. Now, again, words like, um, metamorphosis, you might not say to your 5-year-old. Fair enough. But Ignatius is not doing that in the same way, right? The words that we're talking about here are nothing to do with respect, theology, anything. They're the way we speak. I mean, one of the things that we have a lot in English, in England anyway, I hope it hasn't come over there, but it may have done, is sort of a verbal tick for young people to say like. And then like I was here, and then like that happened, and like then something else. This is the sort of verbal tick that I just don't think that you have the ability to control. And these sort of ticks come out in a textual in text as much as they come out orally, and that's what Ignatius is displaying. And when you see such an overwhelming amount of these words coming out, it cannot just be a respect or a different receiver. It has to be. It's his whole persona, his whole theology, his whole external influences. And again, we haven't touched on the fact that in the Middle Recension, Ignatius seems to have external influences of philosophy, of Roman imperial cults, of Greek second sophistic thinking. In the Short Recension, he doesn't know any of it. How? How has he got an amnesia? How has the text got an amnesia between the Middle and the Short Recension? Again, when do those philosophies really start to flourish? Under Hadrian, under Antoninus Pius, under Marcus Aurelius. So you're saying that Ignatius wrote before these people, and then all of a sudden a revival in Greek thinking came, and then the Middle Recension has Greek thinking in it? Oh yeah. Or either that, or Ignatius is the greatest trendsetter of all time, and Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, and Hadrian loved Ignatius of Antioch, and they get the great Greek inspiration from him. But then after they're gone, the Short Recension goes, no more Greek stuff. Even when it was cool, when it was in trend, it just becomes such a rolling ball to keep effort, a consistent effort, sorry, to try and defend yourself against this idea that the Short Recension was written for different people or in a different time. it's an impossibility, I think.
Can you give us an example of the imperial cult language?
Yeah, best book ever on this. Alan Brent, 2007, Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic. It he the work he does in that book is incredible. And he looks at the role in the middle recension of the bishop, priests, and deacons as divine image bearers, like the emperor in the imperial cult. And he talks about the tupos, the image of the bishop as the father, and sort of this great sort of liturgical play that unwinds, just like some of the Greek myths or Greek liturgies or the Roman imperial cult. And he says that Ignatius takes these on to give his readers a better understanding of what he's trying to get across. You know, they don't understand Christian culture. Their Christianity is a bit new to them. They need a bit of guidance. So he uses real world references to help them sort of get an understanding about what's going on, in the same way that you and I would do today if we were telling people about whatever it might be. And this second sophistic material is absolutely hammered home in the middle recension. Guess where it's not? Short recension is gone. So yeah, that's the book I recommend, and Alan will take you all the way through that. And to be clear, I think that Brent is 100% correct about the influence of the second sophistic in the middle recension. I think that they are desperately trying to modernize Ignatius and put him into this Hellenistic world, this second sophistic world, so that he seems like he can be made trendy again, make Ignatius great again, Migger. But the short retention is gone. So yeah, so that's one of the examples. The idea of the father, sort of the father and the bishop is the image of this divine bearer, and he carries the image of the divine, and the presbyters and the deacons assist him in this. And then he says that Ignatius' journey is like the procession of the emperor on one of his journeys across the empire. He's from the east to the west. He's parading like the emperor with an entourage through to Rome for his grand victory, for his triumph. Again, all gone in the short recension.
Yeah. All right. So I really want to talk about your views of transubstantiation in Ignatius' letter of chapter 7. Before we talk about that, real quick, I just want people to know that Dr. Bull here has a channel, Patristica, where he has really high-profile scholars that come on his channel, and they talk about Ignatius here and a lot of other early church writers, and sometimes deemed as heretics, and Paul's letters, and they do a really good job of getting really detailed scholarship to lay people. So people should definitely check that out. It'll be in the description. Was there any other things that you wanted people to know about as far as where they can get your work at?
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the plug. And one of the things that's so different, I think, about our channel is that we don't do general. We were talking just before the show, weren't we? That our channel only does deep, and we appreciate that. That's never going to make us a 100,000 sub channel, right? We know we might not even reach 10,000, but we refuse to sacrifice the heart of it, which is that we only do deep, and that can be a whole hour dedicated to like. Oh, I used the verbal tick there. Like that can be dedicated to one half of a Pauline epistle, right? Comparing Marcion's version versus the canonical, or one half of one of Ignatius' letters to Polycarp. So yeah, if you're interested in that sort of depth and you're interested in that, then please do come and sub to us. Just maybe to keep an eye out for as well some of our forthcoming publications. So I'm part of a trio on Patristica. There's Marcus Vincent and Mark Bilby and myself. And this year, I think we've got 3 volumes coming out on Marcion of Sinope, who was one of the big recurring characters on our channel. And if you don't know about him, I highly recommend you check him out either on our channel or on someone else's Religion for Breakfast. Has done a video about him. So 3 volumes coming out on him. And then we've also got a real passion for open access. We appreciate that for lay scholars, amateurs in the field, academic books can be £150, probably $200 in some occasions. So we try and make everything free where we can. And so one of the things that we have for free is a translation of Marcion's apostolos, which are Marcion's 10 letters of Paul, but in a slightly different form than we have them in our canonical text. And that's available for free. It's called Paul's Literary Metamorphosis. You can find that online on Zenodo. Maybe I can drop a link to you in the chat, and you can check it out as well.
Awesome. All right. Yep. So people go and definitely subscribe. Check that out. Definitely worth considering there. So the other question I have for you is, where's a good place people can go to access like what you think are the strongest arguments for the short recension? So like the the themes that you talked about, the specific words that are used in one text but not the other, that all that details. Do you have a paper or a book that you've written on it?
So one of my pet hobbies is making William Cureton famous. William Cureton was the first person to publish the Ignatian epistles and in the short recension, and he argued for their authenticity. Theodore Zahn and J.B. Lightfoot crushed his theory, and he was forgotten about forever. This breaks my heart because I think Cureton is wonderful, and he's a fellow Englishman. So I'm doing my best to revive him. So first and foremost, go back to Cureton, read his book from particularly the 1849 one, which is called Corpus Ignatianum, and read his arguments. You can also get a translation of the 3-letter collection there. If you speak Greek and Latin and Syriac, he also gives you the text side by side so you can compare them all at once in every recension, short, middle, long. To be fair, he ignores the Arabic and the other, but don't worry about that for now. The 3 major recensions he gives you. So make Cureton famous, spread the word, get him tattooed on your back, whatever you could do to make him famous. Then perhaps more recently, Marcus Vincent, which I mentioned twice, his 2019 book. In the 4th chapter, he readdresses the Ignatian question, revives William Cureton's hypothesis, and gives you an introduction into what this argument is going to look like. My book, which I'm praying is going to happen this year, but publishing is a difficult field. I've got a publisher, it's just about getting it ready. Could come up this year, and that's going to be called something catchy, but is at the moment called A Textual Analysis of Ignatius to the Romans, Polycarp, and Ephesians in the Short and Middle Recension. Hardly a bestseller. So look out for that when it comes out. I'll be publicizing it all over my Patreon and all over my YouTube when it comes out. And if you are a patron on the Patriska YouTube channel, then if you, I think it's over the $20 mark, then actually I send you my proofs. So not the final version, but one of the proofs for free. So it's got a few spelling mistakes and other little errors, but you can get that for well, I say free for Patreon membership. But ultimately, again, because I'm all about easy access, open access, I basically have described all of this on my channel. So if you don't want to read it, or you can't afford to, or you don't want to subscribe to me, I don't want to make that a limiting factor to your knowledge of Ignatius. So just go to my channel. I've done a reading of all of the Ignatius epistles in the short recension. I'm no Morgan Freeman, I appreciate, but you can listen to it. And I've also then done a deep dive into Polycarp, and Ephesians and Romans are to come. So again, if you don't want to subscribe, you haven't got any money, don't worry about it. Just come over to the channel and I'll walk you through it for free anyway.
Awesome. All right. So, how much time do you have?
We can go.
All right. So, before actually we get to the transubstantiation conversation, I was just want to ask you, was there any other arguments that you think are strong evidence for your view of the letters?
Yeah, reception. Okay.
Okay.
So I mentioned earlier that Polycarp knows him. I mentioned earlier that Irenaeus and Origen and others. I mean, we could also. I mean, I've in my thesis, I've suggested the following. I've put Polycarp, his letter to the Philippians, the martyrdom of Polycarp, the letter to the Gallican churches, Melito of Sardis, Athenagoras, Theophilus, Irenaeus, Clement, Origen, Eusebius. They're the ones I think I've got them all. And I look to see if any of these people have Ignatius, and if they do, what recension. Now, Polycarp, like I mentioned, does not quote one of the letters of Ignatius, so we don't really know what he has. So we know he exists, we know he wrote letters, but that's it. Lucian of Samosata, he's the great satirist of the 2nd century, and he writes these mocking texts of Christians and others. He's sort of like the Saturday Night Live, or for English viewers, the Ian Hislop of his time. He'll take a real life event, exaggerate it, make it look silly. So the reason why these people are so good at what they do is because they'll take a very small strand of truth and then run with it. to the greatest extent. And so Lucian also talks about Ignatius having written several letters. But the problem is, it's very difficult to believe what Lucian says, because he also says that Ignatius of Antioch was a great interpreter of biblical texts and a leader of a synagogue. And Ignatius was neither of those things in any recension. So it's very difficult to work out there what we can trust of Lucian and what we can't. And in addition to that, there's some debate about whether he was even talking about Ignatius, because the figure that he calls the main character of his text is Peregrinus. And in the story of Peregrinus, actually, he ends up leaving the church and not dying for the faith. So it's very difficult to work out quite what that is. But irrespective of what we can know about Ignatius from him, we get no evidence of letters. Where we get our first quotation from a letter is from Irenaeus. And he quotes the transubstantiation passage, or one of them that we're going to talk about later, in Romans 7:3. And he talks about Ignatius being the bread of God, because Ignatius says, I wish to be the bread of God, right? And so that's an early witness to the short recension. Then we get Origen. Well, what does Origen know? Origen also knows the short recension. He knows Romans 7:2 and Ephesians 19:1. Okay, so... Oh, no, tell a lie. No, sorry. Irenaeus knows Romans 4:1, which is not the transubstantiation passage. That's about Ignatius being the bread of God. Ignatius says, I am the wheat of God. By the teeth of the beast I will be eaten, and I may be found the pure bread of God. Sorry. The transubstantiation passage later in 7. So, but irrespective. So Irenaeus knows short. Origen knows short. So we've already got to the beginning of the 3rd century, and we've had 2 attestations of Ignatius, but not in the middle recension. Then we get to Clement of Alexandria. He, again, I don't think he knows Ignatius, but if he does, he knows Polycarp chapter 2, verse 1. May or may not even be genuine, though. The first person to actually give us proper quotations from the middle recension is not until Eusebius. Man, that's so late. That is so late that we have many references to the short and never to the middle until Eusebius. That's crazy, no? If the middle recension is the one in existence. There is actually, interestingly enough, in Origen, one quote from the middle recension to the Smaneans, but the passage he quotes, he does not attribute to the Smaneans. He attributes it to the doctrine of Peter, or the teachings of Peter. Again, interesting, right? He doesn't know this is Ignatius, something else. So that's one of the other arguments, or one of the big arguments. I suppose I lay my hat in 3 sections, I suppose, then. So, it's both the linguistic, the theology, and maybe the influences. We can add maybe as a 4th, the influences on Ignatius, and then also the attestations. They're sort of the 4 pillars of what my argument says. So that the language is impossible. The removal of theology seems unlikely. The witnesses seem to be late 2nd rather than early 2nd for the middle recension. And that the witnesses then who quote Ignatius seem to only know the short first and not until the 4th century in the middle. And as a combined, I think to me is for now a done deal.
Yeah, you also mentioned how we don't have any collection or like a specific source of the middle recension, but we do have just the 3 letters.
Yeah, sorry, how could I forget that? That's very, very important, right? No extant manuscript.
Yeah. So just for clarity, Eusebius lived from 260-ish to 339-ish. So that's 150 years past Ignatius. Yeah, as you're saying, that's a pretty long time to not get any kind of quote source. That obviously that has happened in history. People, the letters, just maybe people don't find it interesting to quote from them. But at the same time, that is really interesting that someone like Irenaeus wouldn't quote from Ignatius, considering he's all about like the church tradition and stuff like that, and quoting people that have authority. So that's interesting.
He also quotes Ignatius anonymously. He says, as a certain one of us said. He doesn't say Ignatius, to be fair, but it's at least one of the epistles. And And maybe just a note on Eusebius. I mean, you gave his dates there, yeah, but his church history probably doesn't come out until, what is it, 313, something like that. So again, it's not even like we could say it's the beginning. When we give the birth of Eusebius, that's a misnomer, right? It's not until the 4th century that he begins to get his material out there properly.
I see. Thank you for that. Yeah, alrighty. So that's kind of a good little summary of your arguments for why you should take it seriously. At the very least, I think you should say, hey, this is something worth considering, maybe even wrong, but worth considering. It's not 100% certain that these texts are authentic. But let's talk about chapter 7 of Ignatius' letter to the Romans. So this is often used to argue for transubstantiation. This was actually talked about in the debate with James White and Joe Heschmeyer. So you do think this letter is authentic, but you don't think this proves some type of transubstantiation, or that they believed, I guess, what Catholics believe today about transubstantiation. So I was hoping you'd comment on that. Maybe we can read from it first. Maybe I can pull it up. Maybe we'll see. Yeah. So there you go. All right. So you get these lovely ads here, but this is on newadvent.org. You can correct me if you like the translation or not. But so relevant portion is, for though I am alive while I write to you, yet I am eager to die. My love has been crucified, and there is no fire in me desiring to be fed. But there is within me a water that lives and speaks, saying to me inwardly, come to the Father. I have no delight in corruptible food, nor in the pleasures of this life. I desire the bread of God, the heavenly bread, the bread of life, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who became afterwards of the seed of David and Abraham, and I desire the drink of God, namely his blood, which is incorruptible, love, and eternal life. Before we talk about the specific passage, can you just give us just a general idea of what transubstantiation is?
So transubstantiation is a belief in the Catholic Church that essentially says that at the words of institution, the bread and the wine becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. So the substance of bread transitions into the body, blood, soul, and divinity. Now, I am not at all a theologian. That's why I went into biblical studies and church history, because that's where dum-dums go. But so that's generally what we're looking at. So this idea of the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ is present within the tiny white disc and in the chalice, right? And this is rooted in Greek philosophy and comes under with great study of a great study of Thomas Aquinas, which ends up becoming one of the Catholic Church's who becomes one of the Catholic Church's leading figures on the subject. And so that's basically what it is. If you want a more in-depth, accidents and incidents and Aristotelian metaphysic and all that sort of thing, I'm not your guy. But that's the general summation of it, right? And as you mentioned, and I guess this is where you want to go with this, this is exactly what the debate was about, or at times. The debate was actually about the masses of sacrifice. But obviously, the nature of the Eucharistic theology is intrinsic to that debate, because ultimately, if it remains bread, then there's no sacrificial element to the Mass. But if it becomes Jesus, that's a slightly different conversation.
Thank you. Alrighty. So there's a big question of how do we know if Ignatius believed that? A lot of what we believe about the view. I mean, when I say believe, I mean what typical Catholics talk about transubstantiation typically has a lot of different, I guess, deep philosophical views, or influenced at least. Would you say that?
Yeah, I mean, most Catholics don't know what they're talking about, so that's a beginning problem.
Okay.
but we're going to go with the Church's understanding, right?
Yeah.
Let's just go with that as a main principle. The Church's understanding of transubstantiation, that at the moment of the words of institution, there is a transition of substance from bread and wine into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. Not looks, not smells, not but is.
Right. So obviously we need to know what the view is before we can figure out if Ignatius believed it. But
Let's
Yeah.
keep it. I mean, if we just keep it simple, right? Like I
Okay.
say, the Catholics literally do believe that this becomes the flesh of Jesus,
Uh,
right? That's just because then there's no ambiguity there, right? Now, the reason why transubstantiation then becomes important is
yeah.
because that is the attempt to explain it using philosophical terms,
Okay.
right? And that is what I'm careful with.
Okay.
So the question about what Ignatius believes about the Eucharist being transubstantiation or not is actually one that can't be answered,
Okay.
right? Because Ignatius doesn't know what the hell you're talking about. I mean, what do you mean a trans a who? I mean, bless his heart. I mean, if I just may, just to say in the short recension, this has a slightly different context. So, the short recension just reads, I do. The pains have burst down over me, and my love is crucified. There's no other fire in me for another love. I do not desire the food of corruption, neither the desires of this world. The bread of God I seek, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, and his blood I seek, a drink which is love incorruptible. And then we don't get any stuff about David. We don't get any stuff about Abraham in the short recension. And then we also don't
Oh
get,
wow.
yeah. Well, all the Jewish stuff. That's another thing that's gone in the short recension. No Jewish stuff. No Old Testament. Maybe that was another one we should have talked about, but there you go. So that's all gone. So that's just, and it's only that bit. So the beginning is not there either. The and set your desires on the world, let not envy find a dwelling place. That's all gone. We only get my love has been crucified. Now, to then address the debate, and this is what I want to really get across. Look, Joe Heschmeyer and White are both Dr. White are much better theologians than me, I'm sure, even though I might disagree with them. Right? They probably thought about this. They probably have a better understanding of the philosophy that surrounds it and all those sorts of things, and that's great. But irrespective of how much they know about what we believe today, we cannot, again, as was mentioned with the Trinity earlier, attempt to retrospectively impose this onto the text of Ignatius. Look at what Ignatius says here. I desire the bread of God, the heavenly bread, the bread of life, which is the flesh of Jesus, the Son of God, who becomes afterwards. Okay, ignore that bit. He is not giving you an exposition on the theology of or the philosophy pertaining to Eucharistic miracles. I think that Virginia Corwin, she actually wrote on the Middle Recension. She said that any analysis which attempts to answer the question of whether Ignatius speaks realistically or symbolically about the Eucharist is doomed to defeat. For in fact, he speaks of both, right? She says that his understanding of the Eucharist is both a literal one, which what transubstantiation people would try and retrospectively put upon him, but also a symbolic one. I would agree with her up until the last line. I would say that he's whether any question that speaks realistically or symbolically is doomed to defeat, for in fact, he speaks of neither. I just don't think that Ignatius thinks like we do. I don't think that he has the same concept of these questions. Now, again, I can't say for certain that he didn't believe that when he said Mass, that the thing he was holding in his hand, he didn't believe was the flesh of Jesus. Maybe he did believe that. But it's a brave step to then impose a Catholic dogma upon him. That's the only point I wish to make. As too is it is a brave position to say the opposite, namely what Dr. White was saying, that Ignatius does not believe it is in some way Jesus that sits on his table at Mass. I just don't like this attitude. I don't like this concept of burdening the text with more than what it wishes to say. If Joe Heschmeyer had finished with, well, Ignatius believed that in some sense Jesus was present physically in communion, that I may have been able to abide. That I might have said, yeah, maybe. Not certain, it's a position, but maybe. But when you say, well, Ignatius had a completely full understanding of the sacrificial nature of the Mass and its offering to the Father as an unbloody representation of the crucifixion, through which the accidents and incidents, the Aristotelian philosophy, the transubstantiation, blah, blah, blah. No, sorry. I just, I just think that Ignatius would have looked at you as if you were an alien and said, I don't know what you're talking about, mate. And that's important, right? That and again, I noticed it with Trinity as well. So I actually noticed that you had a conversation about Trinity the other day, but whether the early church believed in Trinity. If you argue for any model of, with certainty, for any model of either Trinity, modalism, Arianism, whatever it might be, into Ignatius or Clement or Polycarp, you are a fool. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't engage in the same way that we do. I'm sorry, they just don't. And even if they did, they don't give us enough evidence that they really know, for us to really know what they thought. And I think that in this fledgling era of Christianity, the washing machine of theology and philosophy is so great that it's almost hard to catch your breath. For example, Justin Martyr, famous Catholic, proto-Catholic, everyone loves him. Marcion of Stoipe, arch heretic, firstborn of Satan, mother of all deceit. Ignatius, got Ignatius on the brain. Justin and Marcion are friends, or at least to the point where they share communion with one another. Justin writes to him, not against him. So what do we mean about heretics? What do we mean about these ideas? What do we mean about these concepts? This is a washing machine of ideas that are being shared and attempted to understand. Well, Stephen is a good man. He's a friend. I think Ignatius is nothing. Well, Ignatius is something confirmed. We don't know what he is confirmed. Those both things can both be true that we don't know. And I get the desire of theologians, philosophers, historians to try and box these people, but it's a misnomer. It's trying too hard to place into boxes these people is an impossibility.
Thank you. So I just wanted to maybe get possibly your view. So maybe you think it's just completely ambiguous what Ignatius is saying here. So in the text, it specifically says the bread of life, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ. So for people that are Catholic, they say that's the same language I use. So that's got to be what I'm thinking, right? And someone like the Protestant might say something like, "Oh, well, that's what Jesus used, and I don't think Jesus believed in this, so I shouldn't either," whatever. But could you possibly talk about what possibly Ignatius could believe by this? Maybe the different options, and maybe even the most probable one?
Well, I point to the passage I alluded to earlier that Irenaeus quotes, where Ignatius actually says, "I am the wheat of God," and then he says, "that I may be ground in the teeth of beasts, so that I may be found the pure bread of God." Oh, maybe Ignatius is the bread of God, right? Like But on the flip side, right, and this is really important, I don't think a Protestant could say similarly for certain that Ignatius doesn't believe that, again, what he says in inverted commas the Mass, again inverted commas for obvious reasons, what ends up on his altar, he doesn't believe to be the flesh of God or flesh of Jesus. Like, you can't argue that definitively the other way. Now, my belief is that Ignatius does think that what he has on the altar is the flesh of Jesus. What he understands of that, whether he can apply or understand the great Thomist understanding of it, or whether he just goes in the same way that most Catholics do, if they do believe in that doctrine, they go, "Well, it's just Jesus, isn't it?" That is not the same thing, right? They are different understandings, different concepts. And again, not to say that one is contradicting the other necessarily, but that it's so, like, it's definitely true that the person who believes in transubstantiation believes it is the flesh of Jesus, but it's not necessarily the case that the person who believes it's the flesh of Jesus understands transubstantiation, right? They are not mutually inclusive positions. And so my argument for Ignatius is that he believes that Jesus on the altar is present. That's what I think he says.
I see.
But
Okay.
again, that's my understanding of what a very
Yeah.
complex ancient historical figure is trying to tell me
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. All right. So I'm not a scholar in this, but I'm going to try to give it a go. So I was reading this myself, and I thought to myself, there seems to be a lot of metaphorical language in here. So he says, I am passionately in love with death as I write to you. So obviously he's not like in love with a person. That's metaphorical in some way at least. He says, my passionate love has been crucified. He says, there's no fire of material lung within me. He says, but only water living and speaking in me, saying within me. So that's like a lot of metaphorical language. And that doesn't necessarily prove that what he's saying here about the bread of life, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, that doesn't prove that it's not
That
that way. But like if he's going to be using a lot of metaphorical language a little earlier, then it seems to add to the probability that he's using metaphorical language later. What do you think about that?
that's all absent in the short recension.
Interesting. Okay.
And the love that's crucified, here, I think, refers to some scholars say to like his passions, right? That
Hmm.
it refers to like the things of this world. So he's crucified those, and there's no other fired image designed to be fed. And it's interesting because when Origen quotes this passage, he actually says that it's amor, my love, like as in the one that I love, as in like a positive thing.
Hmm.
Because actually, I think the word love there is not. And let me just pull it up because I think that's a bad translation.
You can share your screen if you want to.
Or I'm just trying to find the I'm in Curiton's book, and it's like a puzzle. It's a fantastic book, and everyone should read it. And he's the best scholar ever. But also, it sometimes it's a bit of a puzzle. Because I know that some people have translated that as lusts. So I just want to try and find it just so I can confirm with you. What chapter is this? Chapter 7. Yeah, so the word here in the Greek is eros, right? Like passions. Okay, so this is a negative thing, right? My passions have been destroyed, and there's no other fire in me trying to be fed except that with Jesus, right? Now, if you then read the quote from Origen, and indeed the Syriac, it doesn't use that same negative term. It reads, again, I'll use the word love, but forgive me. It says, my love has been crucified, and there is not another fire within me. And then he says, I'm eager to die, and then I desire the bread of God. So we don't get the same flowery, as you put, metaphor.
Hmm.
All these analogies and nice ideas. All that's gone. He just says, well, I'm dying. I'm pleased to die for Jesus. Well, he doesn't say that quite those words. And I desire the flesh of God. It's very sort of plain.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that is another distinguishing feature between the middle recension and the short recension. Is the middle recension loves flour. The short recension just like, well, it gives the odd analogy, but it basically just spits it out. It's far more, and it almost seems blunt at times. So again, maybe if I could just read just the whole piece. I mean, he says, "Let nothing envy me of those that are seen and that are not seen, that I should be accounted worthy of Jesus Christ. Fire and the cross and the beasts that are prepared for me, amputation of the limbs and the scattering of the bones and the crushing of the whole body, hard torments of the devil, lest these come upon me, and only may I be accounted worthy of Jesus Christ. The birth of pain stand over me, and my love is crucified. There is no fire in me for another love. I do not desire the food of corruption, neither the desires of this world. The bread of God I seek, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, and his blood I seek, a drink which is love incorruptible. So you can see that this doesn't take place within the same lovely fire, water, wolf, like John's gospel. John's gospel loves water. I'm going to die. I'm going to be eaten. All I desire is the flesh of Jesus Christ and his blood, love, incorruptible. Thanks.
That's pretty wild.
It's so short, and then not to mention the fact like I say, he's so short. People have often claimed the short recension must be a redaction because of how blunt it is. But I think that's just consistently Ignatius. I just think he just says what he thinks and he's finished. He's not interested in rhetoric, prose. Just say what you've got to say and get out. And I quite like that attitude.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, so that tells you how complex this conversation is, that people even using it's not as simple as just picking out, okay, we're just going to choose these 3 letters from some random website. We still have to figure out the original sources and all that, and textual criticism.
Now, where I would go a bit further is I think the middle recension does pose more of a stronger case for a literal understanding of communion as being the flesh of Jesus, because it directly links it to docetism, right? And so therefore there's a physical element that's necessary and being and thought about. That the reason why they reject the Eucharist is because they don't think that Jesus could be physically present, right? But in the middle recension, they want Jesus to be physically present. That's why the Docetists don't like it, because they're claiming, the Ignatius of the middle recension is claiming that Jesus is very much 100% physically present in this thing. So I think there is a case to be made there, and that the middle recension interpolator just adds to what he finds in the short recension on that subject in Romans. Yeah, I think, and that's it. But yeah, you're right. And the purpose of my thesis is this. Unlike Lightfoot and Zahn, I am not here to crush the middle recension. That is not my role. My role is to show everyone that the current debate we're having is the wrong debate. We cannot think about what Ignatius believes yet, because we don't know what the hell he wrote yet. And we don't even have a critical edition of his text. We haven't got all the manuscripts yet. We haven't done a proper analysis of the Arabic, of Simeon Metaphrastes' redaction. We haven't looked at the impact on the long as well. Funk and De Camp, right, in 1909, I think it is, say, we think the long recension might be the oldest part of Ignatian epistles at times. I'll give you just one example before we go, because I appreciate this, 90 minutes. In every single epistle that we have in the 3 major collections, the short, the middle, the long, Ignatius has introduced as Theophorus, God carrier, God bearer. In the long recension, however, in one epistle only to Polycarp, he's called Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. That is so strange. In all of the other epistles in the same collection, Theophorus, but in this one, Bishop of Antioch. Which one seems more likely that you would call yourself? God bearer is a pretty arrogant position to hold of yourself, no? And in addition to that name for him is not attested for 300 years. No one calls him God bearer. But lots of people call him Ignatius of Antioch. We then have 2 other recensions, the Arabic and another Syriac one, that calls him not Ignatius Theophorus, but Ignatius clothed with God. Ooh. Another one, again, slightly arrogant, but we don't even know what he called himself in some of these epistles yet. Never mind what the hell he believed in the middle of them. Until we get every manuscript compiled and together in one place, then we can create the equivalent maybe of a Nestle Aland of Ignatius, and then we can know a bit more. And that's exactly the project that I'm trying to get funding for at the moment with Marcus Vincent, so that we might provide that for people. And once we have that, then I'm willing to engage people far more openly about the things that Ignatius may or may not have believed based off the text that we know was his. But all I'm willing to say for now is that the oldest, for the majority text, is the short.
Yeah, thank you so much for going into that. That's pretty funny there, what you said about the arrogance. So just real quick question before you go. How can we be confident in the Greek of the SSR?
So I actually put in the comments that the SSR is actually, I call it the SS3, short Syriac 3 letters. Yeah. So the short Syriac 3 letters aren't in Greek. They're only in Syriac. Only. Now, what Curaton attempts to do is translate them into Greek for us. Maybe I actually do share this just for a moment, because I do think
Sure.
that, like I say, Curiton deserves his moment in the spotlight. I'll just get to the beginning of the thing so you can see what he does. Share screen. In fact, if I just put it over there, it's probably a better idea, isn't it? Okay, so there we go. I've put up. I don't know if you can.
It's loading.
Oh, is it okay?
Attempting to. There you go.
Great. So
maybe zoom in a little bit if you can.
Yeah. There we go. So what Light Curiton does for you is he gives you on the right hand side here the Syriac 3-letter collection. Now we have 3 manuscripts, as I mentioned, for the Syriac. We have one of just Polycarp, and then 2 manuscripts that are Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans. So he largely uses just the one manuscript, then puts in his notes at the end some of the discrepancies. So here he gives you the Syriac. Now over here, he gives you the Greek translation, but that's his own translation. Okay, so we do not have this text in Greek. He bases his translation off the Syriac, but he relies quite heavily on the middle recension, which at this time in life was called shorter. So shorter is middle, longer is long. He relies arguably, I think, too heavily on the middle recension for this translation. That's why you shouldn't trust him. He actually says, "Don't trust me," to be fair, even he recognizes his own mistakes. I'm going to produce another Greek translation hopefully soon. And then down here, he gives you the middle and the long recension in Greek, and the long and the middle recension in Latin. Notice that these are different. And you can see here the thing that I alluded to earlier. So in Greek, in Syriac here, we have Ignatius Theophorus. As you can see in the Greek, Ignatius Theophorus. Short recension, middle recension, Ignatius Theophorus. Long recension, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, back to Ignatius Theophorus. That is wild. Every other letter in this collection, apart from these 2, has Theophorus. So this is why having these texts side by side can be absolutely enlightening. And even if you don't speak Greek, one of the things that Curiton also tries to do here is that where a word is not present in the short recension, he puts it in slightly smaller lettering. So you see this chi here is ever so slightly smaller than the rest of the text. That means that's not present in the middle. In the short. And he does the same with the long. So if there's something in the long that's not present in the short, he puts that in small text. So even if you don't speak Greek and Syriac, he's really helped you there to see at a glance some of the key differences. It's good, isn't it?
Yeah, that's awesome.
So anyway, that book's called Corpus Ignatianum. It's one of the best books of all time. 1849. Go and read it. It's brilliant.
All right. One other question, kind of not related, but just real quick. Are you guys mid-Acts dispensationalists? So I don't even know what that means, so probably not. But do you know what that means?
I often get calls. I often get cool things. I don't know what they mean, and I often am them. But who knows? I don't know if you're referring here to. I assume you are, about miracles and the nature of the apostolic dispensation for things like speaking in tongues and things of that nature. Just cards on the table. I am a Roman Catholic, and so I think that miracles can happen, and that they're not isolated to the period during Acts. However, what that looks like would be something that I think that everyone needs to work a little bit harder at working out, because Protestant evangelical Americans are making a bit of a hash of it currently, both causing detriment to people's psychology and also global politics. So they'd be better off being dispensationalists for the time being.
Fair enough. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. Any last thoughts before you get going?
Pleasure. Please just go read Ignatius, read his text, learn to love him as I do, learn to love the question, and read Curiton and make him as big as you can, because he deserves it.
Oh, how sweet. And check out your YouTube channel for
more
on this topic. Yes, that too. All right. Thank you so much, Jack. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
And you. Bye-bye, guys.